Hi there. Thanks for dropping by. I believe that we are currently in the middle of a paradigm shift, a cultural revolution, not of the kind where people burn things, although we did see things getting burnt during the rallies and riots around George Floyd. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a revolution in the way we think about geopolitics, economics, parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy, society, culture. As one of my guests put it, she said, nothing is settled. I'll give you a concrete example. So when I had my blog from 2013 to 2020, we would meet to debate healthcare, management, leadership, and there was always an assumed fabric that allowed us to have discussions. You could call it an ideational fabric, if you will. By 2020, that fabric had disappeared. You couldn't have discussions about evidence, reason, and logic. People had their minds made up, and if they didn't like what you were talking about or your opinion, that was the end of the discussion. We saw this on a larger stage with policies around COVID. We saw this around debates having to do with science and evidence. For physicians in Ontario, public health simply told us that we weren't allowed to speak against public health recommendations. But on a wider scale, we saw this also with things to do with pronouns, adding pronouns to your emails. It's as though everything is up for grabs. Our ideas about knowledge, our ideas about authority, our ideas about political legitimacy, our ideas about how society is supposed to work. Many people have tried to explain what's going on by appealing to critical theory or versions of Marxism. And I think all of these ideas are worth checking out. They're worth knowing about. But I think it's as though you had a virus. Let's say your computer had a virus or your body has a virus. And we wanted to examine that virus and describe that virus, to sequence the genome of that virus, if you will. The critical theory explanations or the explanations that appeal to postmodernism or Marxism, they all have explanatory power at describing the virus itself. But I don't see a good explanation for why the virus came in the first place. In a medical situation, are we dealing with a patient who aspirates or swallows a little bit of saliva into their lungs every time they swallow? And that's why they keep getting pneumonias. So on the societal level, I think that it's a feature of liberal democracy itself that leads us to getting these expressions of what seem to be mass hysteria or public insanity, a complete loss of rationality. It's a feature of liberalism itself. And it's not just me saying this. The main spokesperson for liberalism in the West is Francis Fukuyama. He said the extremes that we're seeing around the sovereign self or extremes of individualism, he says this hyper-individualism, that's not what liberalism had in mind. But in coming to defense of liberalism, at least in my mind, he's admitting the logical connection between the principles of liberalism and some of the extremes that we're seeing in society. I'd encourage you to read the book. It's a very short book, and most people in society today are some form of liberal, including most people within the large conservative parties. So I think liberalism itself is failing. It fails because it succeeds. So because it's done such a good job at advancing individual freedom, the ability to be free from all forms of coercion, it has led to people tearing down every social institution, everything from family, education, cultural traditions, norms, behaviors. If anything stands in the way of the individual expressing him or herself, then it has to be torn down, according to liberalism. Now, Fukuyama would say that's an aberration of the original understanding of liberalism or classical liberalism, but I don't see how liberalism can help fix the failings of liberalism. You need something else. I think we're in one of those rare times in history when conservatism reawakens. Roger Scruton says that conservatism is a work of rescue. Even liberal authors such as Samuel Huntington says that conservatism doesn't have any holy books. There is no oracle at Delphi that you can go consult to find out what conservatism thinks. It's rather a philosophy that arises in response to stress or revolution or crisis. Now, Huntington argues that way to say that therefore conservatism really doesn't have any ideas of its own. It's only a reaction to a current crisis. There's some truth in him saying that, but I don't think it's the whole truth. I think Roger Scruton does a better job at offering an alternative to liberalism. He presents a very strong presentation of liberalism, and he presents a solid presentation of philosophical or classical conservatism. Now, he was a Brit, and so he's speaking from the British perspective, but it's relevant to people living in Canada, United States, or anywhere across the English-speaking world. And so I think we're in a moment of revolution, and we're needing to rediscover and relearn some of these older conservative ideas. And it'll be frustrating. It'll feel overwhelming. There is no checklist or purity test to find out if you're a conservative or if you're not. So I'll offer one concrete example. Within liberalism, you would emphasize freedom of the individual, like I mentioned, freedom from constraints, voluntary consent to an agreement or to a contract. And a conservative would look at all those ideas and say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. In a business contract, it is voluntary. You do enter into something without coercion or else it's unfair. But a conservative would also say that many of our most important ideas are without voluntary consent. The family is the most obvious example that comes to mind. We don't choose our parents and we don't choose our children. We can choose to have children, but the children we get are a surprise. Anyways, so conservatism offers a much more complex and difficult to understand approach to philosophy. And I would say that's because it's something that has to be lived. And most people already do live it out. Scruton also said that conservative intellectuals find reasons for people who don't need reasons. Roger Scruton spent his life trying to explain conservatism when most people already understand conservatism just simply by living it out. I'll end with this. One of the things that's happening right now in Canada is we have a change from Prime Minister Trudeau to Prime Minister Carney. And Carney has never stood for election, and now we're supposed to see him as our legitimate prime minister. He could stay in office until the government falls or until he calls an election. Now, that might be a strict reading of the rules that we currently have in Canada, but in the eyes of citizens, that, I think, works to undermine trust in government. It makes us question, is this legitimate? If you come to a red stoplight in the middle of the night and there's no one around, you still stop. You recognize stoplights as being a legitimate representation of authority that you should abide by. So that's what I'm talking about with respect to legitimacy. What is the concept of legitimacy? How could we support political legitimacy? We have to ask these tough questions because of the revolution that we find ourselves in right now. It's the only way to rediscover a Canada for the future. It's literally that important. Anyways, you will find some of these conversations completely overwhelming. Part of that is by accident, and I apologize, but part of it is by intention. I want us to become aware that these discussions are tough and they should stretch us. They stretch people who've been studying them their whole life. And that should be exciting for you. It's an opportunity to learn something more, to dig deeper, And it also builds in a sense of humility that these ideas are bigger and grander than any single person is able to figure out completely. So again, thank you for stopping by. I really appreciate that you're checking it out, and I hope you learned something, and let me know what you want to see on the show. Okay, bye for now.